The world of 1910 feels distant, yet its rhythms are not so far removed from our own. Imagine waking up in a home where the silence is broken only by footsteps on wooden floors and the whistle of a kettle. No refrigerator humming in the kitchen, no radio delivering news from afar. Everyday life moved with a kind of patience, measured out in the slow swing of a pocket watch. But change was already stirring. Beneath the calm routines, America was shifting, its future uncertain but full of possibility. Even in the nation's capital, tradition met the first hints of a new era. With the first light of 1910, America stirred to the sound of milk wagons and the steady clip-clop of horseshoes on stone. In city streets, factory whistles broke the morning stillness, while on farms, kerosene lamps cast their glow long before sunrise. For many, time was still marked by the sun's slow climb, not yet by the punch of a factory clock. 7 years had passed since the Wright brothers' flight at Kitty Hawk. But for most Americans, flight remained a rumor. Something glimpsed in a newspaper, discussed in quiet tones, half believed and half doubted. The newspapers that winter mixed tales of distant Balkan troubles with local gossip and the latest from Washington. President Taft, now in the White House, presided with a careful judicial hand, his style a marked contrast to Roosevelt's restless energy. His focus on trust-busting and tariff reform drew both praise and grumbling. The Wall Street Journal called it a curious national mood, confidently progressive, yet apprehensive about what that progress might cost. The country seemed to sense it was moving forward, but not without hesitation. Breakfast in 1910 reflected this crossroads. In cities, families might pour coffee from newly sealed cans, while on farms, the beans were still roasted in the kitchen. The smell of frying eggs and coal smoke drifted through open windows. In New York, Italian immigrants fried peppery scrapple. In Iowa, pancakes and molasses filled the morning air. Electric toasters were a novelty, not yet found in most homes, bread still browned in skillets or over open flames. The streets outside spoke of an era in transition. On Wall Street, messenger boys dodged between electric trolleys and horse-drawn carriages. Chicago's stockyards echoed with the old rhythm of oxen, even as new rail systems began to hum overhead. Shop windows glowed with gaslight, not neon, and hand-painted signs advertised wares. A Sears Roebuck catalog cost 15 cents and promised everything from windmills to wedding rings, all delivered by rail. Industry's noise grew louder every year. Ironworks along the rivers sent smoke drifting across neighborhoods where boys trapped muskrats. In the textile mills, immigrant women tended busy looms, machines that replaced the handwork of their mothers and grandmothers. The Browning machine gun, newly patented, could fire 500 rounds a minute. But most soldiers still carried rifles that had changed little in decades. Technology advanced unevenly. Blueprints for jet engines existed, yet on most farms, mules still pulled the plow. America's confidence showed abroad, but at home, unrest simmered. The Great White Fleet had circled the globe, but when Pennsylvania coal miners struck, the National Guard arrived, bayonets fixed. Immigration swelled the cities, with more than 1 million newcomers arriving that year. The New York Times worried about the immigrant problem, while Western papers mourned the vanishing frontier. Homes balanced old comforts with the first hints of modernity. Parlors still held oak rocking chairs, but Victrola phonographs began to appear. Family gatherings meant music played by hand, not yet by radio. The Boy Scouts, newly founded, promised to toughen city boys with woodcraft, teaching skills already fading from the forests. Department store catalogs offered sanitary undershirts, alongside corsets stiff with whalebone. Schools, too, reflected this tension. Rural children practiced their penmanship with steel nibs and inkwells, reading from McGuffey readers. In cities, textbooks mentioned wireless telegraphy, but discipline still came with a hickory switch. Only a small fraction finished high school, but literacy rates in the North neared 92%. The Pledge of Allegiance, written less than 2 decades before, had already become a daily ritual. New inventions arrived with mixed feelings. The first electric washing machines freed women from the scrub board, but only where power lines reached. Neon tubes glowed at Paris exhibitions, while American homes still relied on gaslight. The Los Angeles aqueduct brought water to thirsty farms, but drained valleys in its wake. Each new marvel seemed to carry a hidden cost. The newspaper on any given morning might report Roosevelt's African safari or the coming of Halley's comet, due that April. People watched the skies with a mix of wonder and worry. Farmers checked their almanacs. Scientists peered through telescopes. Fear and fascination mingled. Some bought comet pills from patent medicine salesmen, hoping to ward off the unknown. Commerce adapted to new rhythms. Woolworths installed cash registers, but street vendors still called out their wares. Hershey's began to mass-produce chocolate bars, undercutting local candy shops. Philadelphia's Wanamaker store boasted electric elevators, though uniformed attendants worked the levers. Even time itself became more precise, as railroads synchronized clocks across the country. Beneath this surface, labor unrest grew. The International Ladies' Garment Workers Union struck the sweatshops of New York, where women stitched shirtwaists for $4 a week. In Chicago, butchers organized against 60-hour work weeks. Newspapers often focused on the leisure of the wealthy, but on factory floors and in tenements, the struggle for fair treatment sharpened. These mornings marked the last breath of a rural America and the first stirrings of something new. The census would soon declare the frontier closed. Horse herds peaked before the rise of the automobile. Crafts like coopering and blacksmithing still supported thousands, but their decline had begun. The Philadelphia Ledger noted a peculiar restlessness in the air, as if the nation holds its breath, wondering what comes next. As the sun climbed, the city and countryside alike braced for the day ahead. The old and the new met in every detail, from the light of a gas lamp to the hum of a distant trolley. In these hours, America found itself caught between two worlds, uncertain but awake. The promise and the tension of the new century just beginning to show. Soon, the day's business would shift to the heart of the capital, where the true battles of policy, power, and progress played out behind closed doors. The iron heartbeat of America in 1910 was steady and insistent, echoing from the brick walls of Pittsburgh's steel mills to the humming garment shops of New York. By midnight, the city's glow looked much the same as at noon, furnaces casting their orange light onto the riverbanks, men moving with practiced caution through the tangle of heat and shadow. In these places, The day's rhythm never truly stopped. 12-hour shifts blurred into one another, and the sound of machinery filled every gap in conversation. Steel production reached new heights. 24 million tons poured from the mills that year. In Gary, Indiana, the air shimmered with heat as workers, many newly arrived from Poland or Slovakia, learned quickly to read the language of whistles and hand signals. Heaters stood closest to the open hearths, sweating out pounds of water each shift, faces wrapped in damp cloths to keep the burning air at bay. They drank salted water by the bucket, knowing that faintness or inattention could mean disaster. One night, a ladle of molten steel tipped unexpectedly, sending a wave of liquid fire across the floor. The men on duty leapt for safety, but one was caught. His boots fused to the ground. The shift foreman wrote later, "The steel does not forgive mistakes." The auto factories in Detroit were their own world, loud, fast, and relentless. Ford's Model T lines ran with a new logic: interchangeable parts, strict timing, and little tolerance for error. Each car that rolled off the line was a small marvel. But the cost was measured in more than dollars. Men at the punch presses worked with hands close to descending steel, and accidents were common. A single moment's distraction could mean the loss of a finger. Painters breathed in fumes that settled in their bones. Wages hovered around $2.50 per day, just enough to keep food on the table, while managers insisted that safety guards were an unaffordable luxury. Child labor was a fact of life, despite growing protest. In West Virginia glass factories, boys with nimble fingers reached into blistering molds to shape bottlenecks. In Pennsylvania, breaker boys as young as 7 picked through coal, their hands raw from the sharp slate. A reformer visiting a mill noted a child asleep on a pile of rags, waiting for the whistle that would call him back to work. The idea of progress was tangled with these realities. New inventions promised relief, but for most, the old burdens remained. Women faced a different set of hardships. In the textile mills from Lowell to Atlanta, they stood shoulder to shoulder in air thick with cotton dust, earning half what men did for the same hours. Mill managers argued that women were naturally suited to repetitive work. But when a group of Boston mill girls walked out in protest, the papers dismissed them as hysterical spinsters. Even at home, new appliances arrived slowly. The electric washing machine, hailed as a miracle in Chicago, was out of reach for families without steady power. Most still scrubbed laundry by hand, boiling water on the stove. Labor unrest simmered just beneath the surface. In Chicago, garment workers struck for shorter hours and better pay, only to be met by police with clubs. Out west, coal miners gathered in secret, passing union pamphlets from hand to hand. The risks were real. Losing a job meant losing a roof, and there was no safety net to catch those who fell. Yet hope persisted. Unions gained ground, and in some trades, skilled workers began to bargain for overtime and safer conditions. The divide between skilled and unskilled labor grew sharper by the year. The contradictions of industrial life showed up everywhere. Company baseball teams played on fields built by the same firms that cut wages. Department stores sold dresses sewn in sweatshops, while families gathered around pianos to play sheet music printed by child laborers. The melting pot of the factory floor brought together Italians, Slovaks, African Americans, and native-born workers, each group keeping to itself during breaks, but all bound by the shared exhaustion of the shift. Factories left their mark on the land and sky. Rivers near the stockyards ran strange colors, and the air over industrial cities was thick enough to cut the sunlight in half. Conservation was a word mostly used by lumber companies planning future harvests. Nature, it seemed, was just another resource to be measured and consumed. At home, life bent to the demands of the factory. Meals were quick, timed to the whistle, and children learned to run errands between their parents' shifts. Even leisure was shaped by industry. Mass-produced harmonicas and baseball gloves found their way into homes, and bicycles rolled off assembly lines in growing numbers. The boundaries between work and rest blurred. Financial shocks could send entire neighborhoods into uncertainty. A small panic in the spring led to layoffs and breadlines, with men riding freight trains in search of the next job. There was no insurance, no guarantee of tomorrow. In the face of all this, a machinist in Ohio wrote, "We are bolts to be tightened or loosened as profits require." Yet change was coming. That year, Henry Ford installed the first moving assembly line, cutting the time to build a Model T from 12 hours to 93 minutes. Workers resisted at first, but the new pace became the standard. The questions raised about fairness, dignity, and the cost of efficiency echoed through every corner of industrial America. As December settled in, the glow from the furnaces spilled out onto quiet streets, painting the night with restless light. It was a world in motion, and somewhere above the clang of metal and the hiss of steam, a new rhythm was beginning to take hold. One that would soon find its way into every parlor, saloon, and city street. A new kind of change was taking root in 1910. It wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was a quiet shift, a new word, or a small invention that hinted at a different way of living. These were the first breaths of modernity, subtle but unmistakable, shaping the country in ways that would only be clear in hindsight. That February, the Boy Scouts of America incorporated in Washington, D.C., borrowing from Robert Baden-Powell's British movement. Early troops gathered in church basements and city parks, their uniforms stitched by hand, their meetings lit by gaslight. The idea of organized adventure, camping, knot tying, learning to read the stars, spread quickly, promising to shape the character of a generation. Meanwhile, in New York, W.E.B. Du Bois and other leaders founded the NAACP, determined to fight racial injustice through courts and newspapers. The Boy Scouts and the NAACP began in the same year, each in its own way capturing the country's urge to build and to challenge, to preserve and to reform. Small inventions and firsts appeared everywhere. Nabisco introduced the Oreo cookie, a modest sandwich of chocolate wafers and cream that would become a staple in American kitchens. Crisco, a new kind of shortening, arrived in grocery stores, promising a cleaner, more reliable way to bake. The Curtis Candy Company perfected a chocolate bar that would later be known as the Baby Ruth, though its true inspiration was already debated. These products seemed minor, but they were signposts, markers of a world where convenience and mass production would soon become the norm. Language itself was shifting. 23 skidoo found its way into city slang, a phrase for slipping away quickly, its origins traced to the gusty corner of Manhattan's Flatiron Building. Jaywalker emerged as a mild insult for those who wandered into traffic, the city's new pace leaving some behind. Soda fountain workers invented names for their drinks, cherry phosphates became tomato smashes, and vaudeville acts spun new slang that would soon echo in every corner of the country. In transportation, the world felt both smaller and faster. Glenn Curtis made headlines with his cross-country flight, completed in short hops, with more than one crash along the way. The first freight truck rumbled from Colorado to Los Angeles, hinting at a future where roads might rival rails. Detroit's streets filled with Model Ts, and with them came the city's first traffic jams and parking tickets. The automobile was changing not just how people moved, but how cities sounded and looked. Buildings reached higher. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Tower in Manhattan, finished that year, briefly held the record as the tallest in the world. Elevators became more common, carrying people upward at speeds that would have seemed impossible only a decade before. Plans for the Woolworth Building were already underway, promising even greater heights. For many, the skyline itself became a symbol of possibility. Communication was in flux as well. The first interstate telephone call, New York to Denver, crackled with static. But the fact it happened at all was remarkable. Telegrams remained the fastest way to send urgent news, but the telephone's promise was clear. In rural towns, mail arrived by train, sometimes twice a day. The world was getting smaller, even if most people still measured distance in days rather than hours. Science edged forward, often quietly. Thomas Edison demonstrated a better storage battery, and Nikola Tesla continued his experiments with high-frequency currents, laying the groundwork for radio. At Johns Hopkins, researchers isolated vitamin B1, though few outside laboratories noticed. Kentucky farmers saw their first tobacco crops resistant to disease, a hint of how science would soon reshape agriculture. Social life shifted too. America's first self-service grocery store opened in California, letting customers pick their own goods for the first time. Department stores began offering installment plans, making phonographs and sewing machines available to more families. Maria Montessori's new school in New York introduced child-centered learning, challenging the old ways of rote memorization. College enrollment climbed, though only a small fraction of Americans would earn degrees. Some changes were less visible, but no less important. The first documented bank robbery using a getaway car baffled police in Indianapolis. Courts began to accept fingerprint evidence, though most still relied on eyewitnesses. Police in New York experimented with call boxes, taking a step toward modern emergency response. In sports, Jack Johnson's defense of his heavyweight boxing title drew headlines and controversy, challenging the country's ideas about race and competition. The World Series filled new concrete and steel stadiums, and night football games flickered under experimental lights. Art and dance took their own small leaps. Isadora Duncan's dancers abandoned ballet's strict forms, and new poets like Robert Frost and Carl Sandburg published verses that sounded plainer, more American. Not every first lasted. The Edison gem phonograph cylinder faded as flat records took over. Early gas-powered appliances mostly failed, waiting for electricity to become widespread. Some inventions, like the first electric blanket, were simply ahead of their time. Change came at different speeds. City dwellers encountered new technologies and ideas first, while rural families adopted them more slowly. The wealthy could afford the latest conveniences, but over time, even modest homes felt the ripple of these early innovations. Each small shift brought the country a little closer to a world we might recognize. In 1910, modernity arrived not as a single event, but as a series of quiet experiments, some successful, some forgotten. These first breaths set patterns that would shape the decades ahead. And as the country adjusted to these new rhythms, the familiar sounds of daily life, like the sharp crack of a bat on a summer afternoon, reminded everyone that some traditions, too, were just beginning to change. Baseball in 1910 was both spectacle and ritual, its rhythms as familiar as sunrise in towns and cities across the country. The sound of a wooden bat meeting a fastball carried across empty lots and grand new stadiums alike, signaling that this game, once rough and improvised, was becoming something the nation took seriously. The sport was still finding its footing, straddling the line between small-town tradition and the ambitions of a growing, restless America. Teams played in concrete and steel cathedrals like Shibe Park, but the details remained rough-edged. Water cups passed down the bench, uniforms that trapped the heat, and a sense that anything could happen on the field. Ty Cobb stood at the center of this changing world. His batting average hovered near .400, and his style was as aggressive as it was effective. Cobb ran the bases with spikes high, sliding hard into second and third, leaving opponents wary and sometimes wounded. Newspapers called him ferocious, and debate swirled about whether his brand of play belonged in the game. Cobb himself shrugged off the criticism, saying he played to win, not to please. His presence brought crowds to the ballpark, but it also exposed the sport's rougher side. Clubhouse fights, public spats, and attitudes that mirrored the country's own deep divides. That October, the World Series drew record crowds to see the Philadelphia Athletics face the Chicago Cubs. Shibe Park's steel and concrete stood out against the old wooden stands scattered elsewhere, its upper decks and high walls drawing gasps from fans. The series became a contest not just between teams, but between styles. Philadelphia's careful, strategic play versus Chicago's power hitting. The Athletics' victory in 5 games signaled a shift toward a more calculated, modern version of baseball. Yet for all its new polish, the game's old habits lingered. Pitchers still threw spitballs, using tobacco juice or licorice to make the ball dance unpredictably. Runners slid hard, sometimes spiking fielders on purpose. Umpires took verbal abuse from players and fans alike, and more than once, a disputed call ended in chaos. In St. Louis, an umpire was chased from the field by a furious crowd. Whiskey bottles sometimes passed down the dugout, and accusations of gambling hovered at the edge of the sport. Bookmakers sat in the stands, and rumors of fixed games circulated quietly, concerns that would soon erupt into scandal. The game was segregated, its boundaries as clear as the chalk lines on the field. African American players formed their own leagues, barnstorming across the country, drawing crowds but always shut out of the majors. Light-skinned Cuban players sometimes found a way in, passing as Mediterranean, but the color line held firm. The best black teams, like the Chicago American Giants, played with a flash and skill that rivaled anything in the majors. But recognition and fair pay remained out of reach. Ballparks themselves told a story of transition. Shibe Park was new and modern, but many stadiums were still patched together with wood, their stands creaking under the weight of eager fans. In Boston, spectators sometimes fell through the floorboards. In Cincinnati, a rope marked the outfield, and any ball past it was left to the umpire's judgment. Groundskeepers worked with whatever tools they could invent or borrow. A street Lewis man famously rigged a wheeled contraption to drag the infield after his mule refused to cooperate. Equipment was little better. Bats came in all shapes and sizes, often whittled by players themselves. Gloves were stiff and undersized, forcing fielders to catch barehanded and transfer the ball quickly. Uniforms were made of thick wool, trapping heat and sweat. Players fainted in the summer sun, their bodies pushed to the limit by heavy clothes and long hours. Salaries revealed another divide. Stars like Cobb might earn $10,000, more than most professionals, while rookies made less than factory workers. The reserve clause bound players to their teams for life. When Chief Bender, a star pitcher, asked for a raise, his owner laughed him off, confident another player would take his place. Few dared to challenge the system, and most played through injuries, knowing how easily they could be replaced. Rule changes came slowly and sometimes haphazardly. That year, a new cork-centered ball made offense livelier, leading to more home runs but also more errors as fielders adjusted to the faster pace. Umpires gained new authority to eject unruly players, but rarely used it, wary of provoking the crowd. The chaos of the game, part strategy, part luck, remained its most enduring feature. Gambling was ever present, its shadow falling across the diamond. Bookmakers mingled with fans, and while most players steered clear, suspicion lingered. A pitcher who walked 7 batters in a row sparked rumors but no investigation. The threat to the sport's integrity was real, but few wanted to confront it openly. Fans brought their own rituals. Ladies' days filled the stands with women, some there for the game, others for the company. Vendors tossed peanuts and hot dogs through the crowd, their voices becoming part of the game's soundtrack. Team songs and chants echoed from the stands, and a lucky vendor in Philadelphia became famous for his ability to throw a hot dog 30 rows up. Baseball's reach was uneven. The Northeast and Midwest embraced professional teams, while the South and West relied on minor leagues or company clubs. Railroad teams entertained travelers, and small towns fielded semi-pro squads that played after church, sometimes drawing the ire of local ministers. Children played in alleys and fields, using tin cans for bases and mowing diamonds into pasture grass. Media coverage grew more sophisticated. Newspapers hired dedicated sports writers and tracked new statistics. Cartoons and columns turned players into folk heroes, and the sporting news doubled its circulation as fans clamored for more. The game began to spread beyond the country's borders, too, with American teams touring Cuba and Japan, planting the seeds of a global sport. Looking back, baseball in 1910 was a mirror, reflecting the country's blend of tradition and innovation, its tensions and its hopes. The game's roughness, its improvisation, and its bursts of brilliance spoke to something deep in the national character, something restless and unfinished. As stadiums emptied and the sun set behind the outfield walls, Another part of American life waited, quieter, but no less central. The gathering of families around the evening table, where the stories of the day found their own place in the rhythm of daily life. Evening in 1910 often meant a return to the kitchen's warmth, where the table waited, set with whatever the day's labor had earned. The family meal was more than food. It was the axis around which the day turned. In a tenement, it might be a folding board balanced on crates, the meal simple but shared. On a prairie farm, the table stretched long, with places for hired hands and children alike. The scene changed from city to countryside, but the ritual held steady, a pause in the day's relentless motion. Meals told their own stories about who you were and where you lived. In cities, families bought what they could carry home, relying on bakeries and corner grocers for bread, eggs, or a bit of beef. Refrigeration was a luxury. Most relied on ice boxes or cool windowsills, and shopping was nearly a daily task. A grocer's ledger from New York lists canned peaches, eggs, and stew meat, small luxuries and necessities bought in careful amounts. For many, bread and potatoes anchored the menu, with a third of the household budget spent just keeping everyone fed. On farms, dinner drew from the land. Potatoes dug from the garden, salt pork from a barrel, coffee ground by hand. Flour, salt, and beans arrived in bulk, and the rhythm of meals followed the seasons. Fresh corn in late summer, apples stored through winter, preserves opened when snow covered the fields. Breakfast started early, especially where factory whistles or roosters marked the dawn. Oatmeal sweetened with molasses, fried potatoes, and coffee were common. Lunch was often portable, a sandwich, a boiled egg, a piece of fruit, wrapped in a waxed paper or a tin pail. Dinner, the main meal, brought everyone together if work allowed. A housewife's diary in Philadelphia notes sausage with sauerkraut and boiled potatoes, with leftovers fried up the next morning. Nothing went to waste. Bones became broth, stale bread became pudding, and every scrap found a use. Cooking was its own kind of labor. Most kitchens ran on cast iron stoves, fueled by wood or coal, demanding constant tending. Wealthier homes had ice delivered to cool their food, while others made do with root cellars or window boxes in winter. Electric stoves and toasters were rare novelties, slow to spread beyond the city's wealthiest blocks. Recipes measured heat by how long you could hold your hand in the oven, and every meal was a lesson in resourcefulness and patience. Women carried most of the work. They planned, shopped, cooked, and cleaned, often while caring for children or taking in laundry. Middle-class brides received cookbooks and advice on managing help. But most women did it all themselves. Men helped with heavy tasks or butchering. But the daily labor of feeding a family fell to women and girls. Children had their own roles, fetching groceries, tending the garden, collecting eggs, or running errands for a neighbor. The children's stomachs never rest, so neither do my hands, wrote a mother in New England. Immigrant families brought their own flavors and customs. Sunday pasta in Italian homes, Sabbath bread in Jewish kitchens, tamales in the Southwest. These meals preserved memories of other places, even as they adapted to American ingredients. Some foods, like garlic or chilies, were eyed with suspicion by neighbors, but over time, tastes mingled. Recipes passed down by word of mouth or scribbled in the margins of well-used cookbooks. Fannie Farmer's Boston Cooking School Cookbook was a favorite among brides, full of precise measurements and aspirations toward middle-class respectability. But most families relied on one-pot stews, cornbread, and whatever could be stretched to fill hungry mouths. Preserving the harvest was a summer and fall ritual. Canning, drying, and pickling filled pantries for the lean months. Housewives traded tips for sealing jars or pickling watermelon rind. And the work left hands stained and sometimes burned. Mistakes could be costly. A bad seal might mean spoiled food and a hungry stretch before spring. Advice circulated in magazines and through neighbors, but old habits died hard. Etiquette at the table reflected the order of the home. The father carved meat. Portions were handed out by age and gender, and conversation often followed rules as strict as any classroom. Children learned to listen, to wait their turn, to eat what was served. In some homes, a pull cord summoned help from the kitchen, a silent servant that let the meal proceed without shouting. Light and warmth came from the stove, especially in winter. The kitchen was the heart of the home, where children finished homework by lamplight and mothers ironed shirts on the table. On cold nights, stones heated in the oven warmed beds, and the smells of bread, soup, and roasted meat lingered in the air. Special treats marked holidays: ice cream in summer, oranges at Christmas, a cake baked for a birthday. These small luxuries stood out against the everyday work of scraping and saving. Change crept in quietly. Electric toasters, pressure cookers, and new canning jars promised to make life easier. But most families adopted them slowly, wary of new costs and uncertain results. The pace of innovation was measured in years, not months, and each improvement set new expectations for what a good home should provide. Even as cities grew and work schedules shifted, the table remained a touchstone. Young people took jobs that kept them away at mealtime. Some families ate in shifts, others grabbed quick lunches at diners or cafeterias. Reformers worried about the erosion of the family meal, seeing it as a sign of deeper changes. Still, for most, the table held its place, a place for stories, for comfort, for marking the passage of days. In kitchens across America, as the last plates were cleared and lamps turned low, the quiet was not just the end of a meal, but the beginning of reflection. The questions of the day, the hopes for tomorrow, and the pressures of a changing world all gathered in the hush after supper. Outside, the world pressed on, restless and unresolved, as new ideas began to find their way into every corner of daily life. If you listened closely in 1910, you could hear the country's pulse in the roar of its crowds. City blocks emptied for the big game, and the echo of 1,000 voices rose from ballparks, boxing rings, theaters, and fairgrounds. Public gatherings weren't just about distraction. They were a stage for America's arguments and ambitions, a place where people measured themselves against each other and the times. Baseball diamonds drew fans from every walk of life. The World Series between the Philadelphia Athletics and the Chicago Cubs filled newspaper pages and barbershop talk for weeks. Connie Mack's Athletics played a measured, strategic brand of ball, bunting, and stealing bases with precision. The Cubs, by contrast, relied on brute force and big swings. The debates in the stands mirrored those in the papers. Was baseball a science or a test of raw will? Ty Cobb, with his near .400 average and relentless spikes-high slides, became a lightning rod. Some called him the purest competitor the game had ever seen. Others saw only a bully. The field itself was rough around the edges. Players chewed tobacco, spitballs were legal, and umpires braced for heckling that sometimes turned physical. The crowd's energy was unpredictable, and the game's roughness reflected the country's own unfinished edges. Boxing, too, was a spectacle that drew America's attention and its anxieties. Jack Johnson, the black heavyweight champion, defended his title against Jim Jeffries, the so-called Great White Hope, on July 4th. Johnson's victory sparked riots in cities across the country, the violence underscoring how tightly race and sport were bound together. Newspapers described Johnson's style with thinly veiled prejudice, focusing on his cunning and brute strength, rarely crediting his skill. The fights themselves were brutal. Thin gloves, few stoppages, and rounds that could stretch on indefinitely. Major bouts were sometimes staged on barges or moved across state lines to skirt laws. Ringside, bookmakers took bets openly, and the crowd's mood could turn in an instant. Vaudeville offered a different kind of excitement. Theaters filled with families, workers, and anyone seeking a few hours' escape. The programs were a patchwork. Opera singers, acrobats, comedians, trained animals. Headliners like Houdini and the Marx Brothers tested their acts before audiences that could be as tough as any fight crowd. Performers learned to read the room. What worked for the afternoon matinee might flop with the late-night crowd. Applause meant higher pay. Heckling or silence meant a quick exit. Backstage, the world was as competitive as any field or ring, with strict pecking orders and little patience for weakness. Horse racing still drew gamblers and the wealthy, though reformers were beginning to chip away at its dominance. At the Belmont Stakes, fortunes changed hands in minutes, and the paddock was a swirl of money, gossip, and nervous anticipation. Jockeys rode under dangerous conditions, pushing their bodies to the limit for a shot at glory. Doping scandals and fatal falls were part of the sport's reality. But the spectacle endured. Racing forms became a kind of Bible for bettors, promising insight in a world ruled by chance. Saloons and bars remained gathering points in city neighborhoods and rural crossroads alike. In the city, a bar might offer a free lunch with every drink, a place to read the paper and catch up on gossip. Back rooms hosted union meetings or friendly card games. In smaller towns, the saloon could be rougher, a place for hard talk and harder liquor, where the line between law and disorder was thin. The temperance movement pressed in, with new prohibition laws in several states. But for many, the saloon was still the social heart of the block. Circuses brought the extraordinary to every corner of the country. The arrival of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey's show could stop a town in its tracks. Parades of elephants and acrobats, sideshows with human oddities, and the ever-present danger of the high wire or the lion's cage. These spectacles drew crowds who came to marvel and to forget. The risks were real. Aerialists fell, animals escaped, and the work was as grueling as anything in a factory. But for a day, the circus made the world feel bigger and more mysterious. At the beach, crowds flocked to Coney Island and lakeside resorts, riding new rail lines out of the city for a taste of freedom. Bathing suits and public dancing sparked debates over decency, with police sometimes measuring hemlines and chasing away the boldest bathers. Many beaches remained segregated, and the promise of escape was not equally shared. Still, the scent of popcorn and the sound of laughter mixed with the crash of waves And for a few hours, the crowd belonged to itself. College football and auto racing added their own notes to the country's clamor. Football games packed stadiums, brutal, fast, and sometimes deadly, with little protective gear and a willingness to play through pain. The new Indianapolis Motor Speedway hosted its first 500-mile race, and the crowd thrilled to the sight of cars tearing past at unheard-of speeds, drivers risking their lives for a chance at fame. All these entertainments were shaped by the crowd's presence, the collective energy that made every event feel urgent and alive. Sociologists and psychologists began to study these gatherings, trying to understand what drew people together and what they found in the shared experience. They saw that leisure was becoming a regular part of life, not just a rare escape. The line between work and play was changing, and so was the meaning of the crowd itself. As the days shortened and the air turned cold, attention shifted back indoors. The kitchen stove became the new gathering place, its warmth and the scent of supper drawing people close. The noise of the crowd faded, replaced by the quieter rhythms of home. Yet the memory of those shared moments lingered, shaping the stories and the appetites that would simmer through the winter ahead. Music in 1910 was everywhere. On the street corners, in the parlor, echoing from the open windows of boarding houses and saloons. The syncopated rhythms of ragtime, with their restless energy, had begun to seep into the fabric of American life. Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag was already a staple, its bright, tumbling notes drifting from upright pianos that stood in nearly half of American homes. Tin Pan Alley publishers in New York churned out catchy melodies, each designed to catch the ear within the first few bars. And song pluggers played new tunes in department stores, hoping to spark the next craze. Not everyone welcomed this musical shift. The cultural gatekeepers, conservatory-trained musicians, critics, and directors set up their defenses. The director of Boston's Symphony Hall banned ragtime from the concert stage, calling it musical chaos. Music teachers warned students that syncopation would ruin their technique. John Philip Sousa, the March King, dismissed ragtime as beer hall music, though even his own compositions began to borrow its bounce. The battle lines were clear, tradition on one side, innovation on the other. Yet, outside the formal halls, ragtime flourished. In the evenings, families gathered around pianos for sing-alongs. Popular songs like Let Me Call You Sweetheart and sentimental ballads about lost loves. Sheet music was affordable, and the covers promised romance, adventure, and a hint of mischief. The player piano, a marvel of the age, allowed even those without lessons to fill their homes with music, its perforated rolls spinning out complicated rags and marches with mechanical precision. The phonograph was changing the way people listened. Edison cylinder players were giving way to Victor's flat disc records, prized for their improved sound. For the first time, it was possible to hear a favorite tune exactly as it had been played, over and over, whenever you wished. Some musicians viewed this with suspicion, fearing that recordings would rob music of its soul. But audiences were captivated. African American musicians, however, faced barriers. Record companies often released their work under generic labels or credited it to white performers, a shadow that would linger for decades. Theater, too, was shifting. Broadway was alive with new musicals, George M. Cohan's patriotic shows, operettas like Madame Sherry, and vaudeville acts that blended slapstick with song. The Metropolitan Opera held fast to European tradition, its ticket prices keeping it out of reach for most. But in the Lower East Side's Yiddish theaters and in immigrant neighborhoods across the country, audiences packed in for plays that mixed Old World stories with New World realities. The boundaries between high and low culture were still firm, but more Americans than ever were finding ways to cross them. Literature reflected these tensions. Jack London's Burning Daylight was a bestseller. Its rough frontier heroism, a world away from Edith Wharton's quiet, psychological Ethan Frome. Critics debated what counted as real literature. Meanwhile, the first issue of The Crisis, edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, brought essays, poetry, and art into the national conversation about race, challenging readers to reconsider what belonged in the canon. Visual art was in flux. The Ashcan school painters, George Bellows, John Sloan, and others, turned their attention to the everyday grit of urban life. Their canvases showed street brawls, crowded tenements, and the unvarnished reality of the city. Critics called these paintings vulgar, preferring safer landscapes and genteel portraits. But in Alfred Stieglitz's 291 gallery, Americans were introduced to European modernism, sparking debates that would crescendo with the Armory show just a few years later. Technology blurred the lines between art forms. Stereopticon shows projected images with live narration, creating early multimedia experiences. Advertising borrowed techniques from fine art, with illustrators using impressionistic styles to sell soap and cigarettes. The Brownie camera put amateur photography within reach, and sketching lessons appeared in women's magazines alongside recipes and sewing patterns. Cinema was the newest art, still finding its voice. In 1910, Edison Studios released the first filmed adaptation of Frankenstein, a brief, silent spectacle that hinted at the medium's potential. D.W. Griffith at Biograph was experimenting with camera angles and editing, pushing the language of film forward. Nickelodeons, with their hand-painted signs and continuous performances, became a fixture in urban life. For 5 cents, anyone could step into a darkened room and watch stories unfold in flickering light. Critics worried about the effect of these new entertainments, but audiences were undeterred. The movies, like Ragtime, were both a mirror and a hammer, reflecting the world as it was and shaping the world to come. Across the country, regional styles persisted. New Orleans musicians blended ragtime with blues and Caribbean rhythms, laying the groundwork for jazz. Appalachian ballad singers kept centuries-old songs alive. In the Southwest, Mexican-American families performed corridos, narrative ballads about daily life and struggle. Despite the rise of national trends, local voices remained strong. Censorship and commercial pressures shaped what art reached the public. Watchdog societies in Boston and New York banned books and plays they deemed immoral. Theater chains consolidated, music publishers formed trade groups, and art dealers courted wealthy clients, all seeking to control what was seen and heard. Still, for most Americans, cultural life remained a patchwork of public spectacle and private participation. Singing at the piano, snapping photographs, or saving pennies for a ticket to the latest show. As the year wound down, holiday sheet music and winter exhibitions filled stores and galleries. The surface seemed calm, but beneath it, The arts were alive with contradiction. A push and pull between old and new, mass appeal and personal vision. The sounds and images of 1910 were more than background noise. They were the soundtrack of a country in transition. Just as melodies echoed through the parlor and the theater, another sound was always present. The quiet, persistent rustle of fabric, the creak of shoes, the daily choreography of getting dressed. In 1910, even fashion had its own story to tell. In 1910, the fabric of society was not just a metaphor. It was something you could see, touch, and sometimes feel pressing in on your ribs. Clothes did more than shield from the weather. They mapped out the boundaries of class, gender, and ambition. What someone wore on a Tuesday morning or Sunday afternoon marked their place in the world, and the rules for getting dressed were as intricate as any social custom. For women, fashion was a daily balancing act. The morning began with the ritual of lacing a corset, pulling in the waist and pushing out the hips for that fashionable S-bend silhouette. Over this came layers: a petticoat, a starched shirtwaist, a skirt that swept the floor. The full ensemble could weigh close to 7 pounds, and putting it on without help was nearly impossible. Still, small changes crept in. Hemlines inched up, just enough to show a flash of ankle. A few daring young women took to the streets in hobble skirts, so tight at the hem that walking became a careful, mincing process. In department store windows, the new health corset was displayed with hopeful promises. A young woman, pausing in front of the glass, might read an ad touting freedom from the old restrictions, and wonder if this softer, more flexible corset would finally let her breathe. The idea of comfort was a quiet rebellion, one that didn't shout but lingered in the back of the mind. Men's suits were a language all their own. The three-piece sack suit, jacket, vest, trousers, was the uniform of respectability. Dark wool for winter, lighter tweed or linen for summer, always with a stiff collar and a tie knotted just so. Most men owned 2 suits, one for every day, one for Sunday best. Shoes were polished leather, and a hat was as essential as a handshake. For the working man, sturdy overalls or denim signaled readiness for labor, while office clerks stuck to pressed shirts and narrow ties. The rules were clear, and stepping outside them drew notice. Children's clothes followed the patterns of their elders, with a few bright exceptions. Girls wore dresses with sashes and bows. Boys, after graduating from toddler dresses, donned knickerbockers. Sometimes, a girl might tug at her skirt, wishing for the freedom of a split skirt or bloomers, practical for climbing trees or running to school, but still rare outside the playground. The hobble skirt, for all its impracticality, became a symbol for a generation eager to test boundaries. Fabrics themselves marked the lines of class. Silk tea gowns and Paris imports were the privilege of the wealthy, their care and cleaning a job in itself. Middle-class families relied on cotton or wool, often sewn at home from patterns clipped from Ladies' Home Journal or ordered from a Sears catalog. The poorest made do with sturdy linens, patched and handed down until nothing remained but scraps for quilts or rags. Ready-made clothing appeared in department stores, promising real American fit. But not everyone trusted the new sizing or the loss of a personal touch. Accessories completed the picture. Gloves, hats, parasols, and pocket watches announced status without a word. A woman's hat might be trimmed with feathers or artificial flowers, sometimes so wide it required careful maneuvering through a doorway. Conservationists protested the millinery trade's appetite for rare birds. But the trend continued. Men's watches on gold chains, stick pins, and polished shoes all spoke to a quiet competition for respectability. Sports and leisure began to reshape what was considered proper. Tennis and cycling introduced looser sleeves and split skirts, though some society columns sniffed at the athletic look. Golf jackets and walking suits crept into everyday wear, and even the most traditional wardrobes began to shift, if slowly. The spread of ready-to-wear clothing changed the landscape. A shirtwaist could be had for $1.50, a suit for $10, and the mail-order system brought fashion to rural towns as quickly as to city blocks. Older generations worried about declining craftsmanship, but the convenience of store-bought clothes was hard to resist. By the end of the year, a growing share of urban wardrobes came from department store racks, not the family sewing machine. Fashion also became a quiet battleground for social tensions. Shirtwaists, once just practical blouses, became a symbol of working women and labor strikes. African American families dressed with special care for Sunday services, using sharp suits and elegant dresses to counter prejudice and assert dignity. Immigrant communities mixed old country traditions, lace collars, shawls, kimonos, with American styles, creating a patchwork of identity that was both proud and practical. Underneath it all, the world of undergarments was shifting. The first bust supporters appeared, offering an alternative to the corset. Silk stockings became more affordable, though most women still wore cotton. Men's union suits, with their infamous trapdoors, were standard issue, stifling in summer but necessary in winter. Advertisements promised sanitary benefits, playing to a growing awareness of health and cleanliness. Special occasions had their own codes. Wedding dresses followed the fashion for white, but many brides simply wore their best dress. Mourning required a year in black, with gradual easing back into color. At the seaside, lighter fabrics and shorter sleeves were allowed, while winters called for woolens and fur muffs. The work of caring for clothes was unending. Laundry meant boiling water, scrubbing by hand, and hanging everything to dry. Ironing was a full-day task, with flat irons heated on the stove. Repairs were constant. Darning socks, turning shirt collars, patching trousers. Children learned to sew before they could write, and nothing was discarded until it was truly beyond use. As winter crept in, families unpacked heavy coats and woolen layers, the scent of mothballs and last year's cold weather rising from trunks and closets. These rituals tied generations together, each season's clothing a reminder of those who had worn them before. All these choices, what to wear, how to mend, what to save for Sunday, wove together into a living record of daily life. But even as people stitched and buttoned and laced themselves into the fashions of the day, another kind of fabric was taking shape. It was spun from the words people used, the slang and sayings that colored conversation and hinted at the changing mood of the country. In the next breath, the language of 1910 would reveal just as much as a wardrobe ever could. Discovery in 1910 did not announce itself with fanfare. It arrived in the slow turn of gears, The careful measurement of powders, the scribbled notes in the margins of lab books. The spark of discovery was not a single flash, but a steady, persistent glow, one that lit up laboratories, workshops, and even the quiet corners of kitchens and barns. America's inventors, scientists, and tinkerers pressed on, not knowing exactly what they would find, only that the world was changing under their feet. In Menlo Park, Thomas Edison's laboratories never truly slept. Workers in shirt sleeves adjusted filaments, tested new materials, and sent up bursts of light that startled neighbors in the dark. Edison himself moved from project to project, his incandescent bulb improved by teams who sometimes saw daylight only in passing. The pace was relentless, and the sense of being on the edge of something new was never far away. Across the ocean, Marie Curie worked late into the night, her hands marked by the silent burn of radium, while in America, physicists puzzled over the strange spaces inside atoms, their chalkboards covered in equations that hinted at invisible worlds. Not all discoveries were made in grand laboratories. Some took shape in the open air. Aviation, once a curiosity, became a headline. In June, Glenn Curtiss received the country's first pilot's license, a slip of cardboard that marked a new era. That autumn, Eugene Ely coaxed his biplane onto the deck of the USS Birmingham, landing on a wooden platform above the waves. The feat was brief, almost clumsy, but it proved what many had doubted: a flying machine could serve the military. The Wright brothers, meanwhile, pressed on with their own designs, wary of imitators but unable to slow the pace of invention. What was a marvel in 1903 had, by 1910, become a race. Medicine, too, edged forward, though not always smoothly. Dr. Paul Ehrlich's magic bullet, Salvarsan, promised a cure for syphilis, but its arsenic base frightened as many as it helped. In Baltimore, researchers at Johns Hopkins confirmed that certain vitamins were essential for health, though the word itself was still new. X-rays, just over a decade old, found uses in hospitals and carnivals alike. A Chicago doctor boasted of finding a swallowed penny in a child's throat, the image appearing ghostly on a glass plate. The risks of radiation were little understood, but the thrill of seeing inside the body outweighed caution. Chemistry bubbled with new possibilities. Leo Baekeland's Bakelite, a hard, heat-resistant plastic, began to replace wood and ivory in everything from telephone casings to jewelry boxes. The phrase, "the material of 1,000 uses," was not an exaggeration. In Germany, Fritz Haber's process for fixing nitrogen from the air promised to feed millions by enriching the soil, though its darker uses would only become clear later. American chemists celebrated these advances, seeing in them the promise of a world remade by human hands. Astronomy stretched the imagination outward. Halley's comet swept across the spring sky, drawing crowds to city parks and farm fields. Some watched with awe through borrowed telescopes, others with dread, stocking up on anti-comet pills and reading dire predictions in the papers. At Harvard, women known as computers pored over photographic plates, cataloging new stars and expanding the map of the universe. The canals on Mars, reported by Percival Lowell, fueled talk of life beyond Earth, even as skeptics rolled their eyes. Engineering changed the shape of daily life. The Pennsylvania Railroad electrified its tunnels into Manhattan, replacing the sooty breath of steam engines with the hum of new machines. In Detroit, Henry Ford's first moving assembly line cut the time to build a Model T from 12 hours to under 2. The machines did not rest, and neither did the workers who fed them. Some saw liberation in the promise of efficiency. Others saw only the threat of jobs lost to automation. Communication moved faster than ever before. Automatic telephone exchanges began to replace human operators in big cities, their mechanical clicks and whirs unnerving callers used to a friendly voice. In rural areas, party lines still tied whole communities together, the ring of the bell as much a part of daily life as the rooster's crow. A single coast-to-coast phone call cost $20, half a month's wages for most workers. But the fact it was possible at all seemed a kind of magic. The darker side of progress was never far behind. Leaded gasoline, introduced to smooth the running of engines, spread invisible poisons through the air. Synthetic fertilizers boosted crop yields, but seeped into rivers and streams. Radium-infused tonics promised health and energy, but left users with illnesses no doctor could name. Each invention brought new possibilities, but also new risks, costs that would not be counted for years to come. Science was not immune to the prejudices of its age. Eugenics, dressed up as modern biology, found a foothold in universities and state houses. Indiana had already passed a law allowing forced sterilizations, and other states debated following suit. IQ tests, developed to help struggling students, were twisted into tools for ranking whole populations. The first International Eugenics Congress met at Columbia that summer, its papers full of dangerous confidence. These ideas traveled quickly, slipping from academic journals into popular magazines and dinner-table conversations. Even the weather was a field for discovery. The U.S. Weather Bureau connected observation stations by telegraph, hoping to predict storms before they struck. Their forecasts rarely reached beyond 2 days, and farmers still trusted almanacs over government reports. When a tornado tore through Oklahoma that April, the Bureau's failure to warn left many doubting the promise of science. Yet for all its failures and fumbles, the spirit of discovery in 1910 was hard to dampen. Museums filled with new exhibits, inviting visitors to crank levers and peer through microscopes. Scientific American explained radioactivity in plain language, and school children built models of the atom from wood and wire. The line between expert and amateur blurred, as the public claimed a share in the excitement. As the year wound down, the cold seeped into laboratories and classrooms. Students huddled over experiments, their breath fogging the glass. Professors lectured on theories that would soon be tested in ways they could not imagine. The spark of discovery, sometimes no more than a flicker, burned on, lighting the way toward futures both bright and shadowed. And so, as 1910 drew to a close, the country found itself waiting for the next breakthrough, the next headline, the next quiet moment when the world might shift. The threshold between what had been and what would come was thin. The spark was there, ready to catch, and the story was just beginning to turn. The year was 1910. The echoes of that time linger in the hum of factories, in the rhythm of new music, in debates that still feel familiar. We've wandered their streets, glimpsed their hopes, and listened to the quiet courage that lived in small daily acts. People then moved through routines that shaped the future without fanfare. Each morning, an unwitting step into history. If you pause for a moment and let the noise of today recede, You might sense it, the steady undercurrent of lives unfolding, the gentle persistence of dreams, the weight and wonder of change.